Welcome. I'm Rob Duncan with the CUNY Games Network, and I'm here with Joe Bisz, a professor, associate professor in the Department of English, who's also the co-founder of the CUNY Games Network, and we're going to talk about some of the projects he's been working on and how he came to games-based learning.
Awesome.
So that is the first question. Joe, how did you get interested in games-based learning?
Yeah, so it's been a while now. So as you mentioned, I'm a professor here in the Department of English at CUNY, Borough Manhattan Community College, City University, New York. I started out, I got my PhD in English literature and creative writing, which basically gave me a love for, I think, doing analysis, but creatively.
Mm-hmm.
So I came to this department, started doing more or less traditional work, and like everyone else, I considered myself to be an active teacher. I tried to do active things in the classroom. I tried to bring in moments into my lectures or discussions where students were doing student-centered activities. I put a little bit more attention to my learning activities, trying to develop them a little bit more. I found that learning activities were pretty useful because it can focus their attention for a while. But after a while, they're trying to understand the parts of an essay. Maybe it's a well-scaffolded exercise, but there can be a little bit too much focus on the learning, and the activities could get a little bit dull.
Mm-hmm.
So I started wondering, is there a way that I can make this a little bit more interactive, a little bit more engaging, a little more gamed up? And after a lot of work and theorizing about this, that's what started bringing me into game-based learning. See, I think it's a real challenge as an instructor to create meaningful exercises that actually have both deep learning happening, but also deep engagement. And there's a whole field behind this, not just game-based learning, but thinking about these pedagogies. And whether you're a teacher, a content designer, or even a training manager, trying to bring these mechanics into your exercises can be really useful.
So you talked about, it's going way back, you talked about analyzing things creatively in English. What does that mean?
So basically, when I'm in English, I like to bring in a narrative or some kind of a little bit of play into my writing. So I started writing about learning activities, but then I was thinking, well, maybe I should put a little bit more effort into making these activities more playful so that there's something even more creative I can be writing about. For example, sometimes I have to teach vocabulary, I have to teach thesis writing. I'm using a common learning activity in the classroom. But after a while, I started thinking, isn't there a way I can add a visual component to this element? Can I add some kind of board? Can I chunk the information onto cards for the students to solve? So very slowly, this started slipping me into game-based learning. I didn't realize that's what it was at the time. I partnered with one of my colleagues, Professor Carlos Hernandez. We reached out to other professors. We started uncovering the pedagogy behind this. But here I should make a point. I need to add what game-based learning is for me.
Okay.
And perhaps a great deal for you too, Rob.
Fluid definition, for sure.
For me, it's not just about digital games. That's so important, I gotta say it again. It's not just about digital games. I think I just lost half my audience. But yes, there's a lot of studies about digital games. It shows the efficacy of using games, the power of using games in the classroom. However, a lot of these studies and what they're showing about games and the mechanics and the principles, it's the same thing that are happening in pen and paper games. So my shtick is to try to show faculty how they can actually use games in the classroom that they create, that they're going to adapt to their own exercises just by adding little mechanics that you might find in any of these board and card games that we see.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the audience you're dealing with, because game designers, be it digital or non-digital, they understand these subtleties, but when you're bringing the concept of game to either an experienced person who's coming from the scholarship of teaching and learning, or somebody who's a domain expert, there's this preconceived notion of what a game is, and they might not understand these subtle differences. But it really just comes down to the design. I say it's the design of human experience.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah. But interesting. Okay, so what it sounded like you were describing when you were talking about this creative analysis is that you're trying to bring some kind of visual or tangible element to reading or analyzing literature with your students. Did you find that they were really struggling with the abstraction or the storyline, or what is it that that they were not performing well at, that you felt you need to bring in an active learning component?
So, I'm gonna spin part of the fault maybe back in my direction a little bit. Often, as instructors, when we want to explain something to the students, especially something that's complex, we can't help but fall back upon literally an active explanation. Maybe we show them a few models. That's always a good thing, a few examples. And we somehow think that this act is going to work with them just as it may have with other learners or does with other faculty. At its heart, I think that using game-based learning pedagogy, and perhaps even what it means by active learning, is to have the student practice and not just listen what it is that you're informing them about, which means you have to break down reading skills or creative writing skills into some kind of thinking step that the students can practice. I like to think of it in terms of a learning activity. I know a lot of teachers use learning activities, even if the word games sounds foreign to them. But when we move over to game as opposed to learning activity, it's just about thinking a little bit more precisely about the elements or mechanics that you can plug into that activity. Can I make this activity a little bit more random? Can I make it a little bit more rapid? Can I add some kind of reward structure in order to make it more interactive or enhance it to some extent?
Yeah. So were you ever attracted to using role play? I know that now, since games-based learning is entering the common vernacular in pedagogy more every day, more people I know in the lit world are using role-playing games. Did you try those first? I mean, it's very interesting that it sounds like you didn't, and I'm curious as to why or why not. Or
role-playing games are becoming quite popular. I would say after using trivia questions in the classroom, some kind of role-play structure is probably the most popular way to use games or simulations in higher learning. I've never been too much for role-play structures as long simulations. And maybe it's because as a creative writer, I'm so attached to the narrative of the story that I'm exploring that I almost don't want students to play with it too much and making it like to come too far out of the text. I'm not sure, but I have used the elements of roles and identity, which I think is very powerful. And just asking questions to the student, imagine yourself as this character, or do a small presentation from the point of view of Hamlet or Karl Marx talking about freedom. So to try to bring that kind of play and identity principle.
Well, maybe in that way it speaks to scope. For example, you wouldn't have a junior game designer to design some massive epic game. So in role play, I mean, most role play is really derived from Dungeons and Dragons, right? And that is a game that is massive in scope, not only in the possibilities of decisions that happen in any moment, but just the rules, right? That comes in so many books. I can see why you would not want to approach Dostoevsky from a role-playing view, because you don't want all these things to be disturbed, but maybe speak to the point of characterization or a specific element. Interesting.
But yet one of the things that's so great about game-based learning is there's different ways to approach this. Other teachers, especially theater teachers, might get more into the aspect of role play or having some kind of performance-based classroom. And it's enough that I see the work that other teachers are doing, and I think, well, maybe I should be approaching the teaching of novels in this particular perspective.
Who knows? Who knows? I know that Keith Johnstone in his experimental theater workshops was, I guess a lot of people cite him as being the originator of improv, or what we now call modern improv. He had a bunch of theater games. Do you know of any games that were more of a role-playing scenario in that world?
So perhaps some of our audience is aware of the big effort being done out of Barnard College. This is the Reacting to the Past role-playing series, not just for historians. Many people, college and high school faculty, are using the series of modules to add a simulation component to their classroom, and the students can dress up and perform the roles and enact debates, and simulations, and analysis that would need to typically happen in the classroom anyway.
Yeah, and that opens the door to new possibilities in problem solving and thinking, and things emerge in the moment that can't really be planned.
Yeah.
It's more than just being an actor and inhabiting a role. Before I get too far off the beaten path here, I want to point out that you've actually made a lot of games yourself to teach people how to incorporate game-based learning into their classroom. Do you want to describe a couple of those?
Absolutely. So, normally I might boringly summarize for all you my theories from my articles, but I don't have to do that because my games actually summarize these things. So one of the first games I made, which became pretty famous, is called What's Your Game Plan?
Yeah.
And this is a pretty straightforward game, although I guess there's elegance and simplicity, whereby if you're an instructor and you want to create some kind of gamed up exercise or learning activity, or even if you're somebody in the business world and you're looking for an idea to game up your training activity, you draw a few cards. You might draw a card that offers a sample game influence, like Scrabble or Monopoly. Then you draw a card that offers a sample mechanic, like using some kind of role cards, character cards that might give your players a particular role and a particular power to affect the game. Some kind of interaction, like perhaps the act of trading, like trading information. And then you have some kind of lesson in mind that you're trying to teach. And you look at these cards and you think about, okay, how can I incorporate at least one element from Scrabble, from trading, and from role cards into my idea to teach thesis writing, or my idea to teach employees, how to be more organized. And of course, like a lot of other things, this works best when you're actually brainstorming with other people, because then you have a smart mind next to you and you can bounce ideas off of them and come up with an activity. So I use this as the basis for my own workshops. I'm a professional development speaker. I travel the country teaching teachers and also people in the business world how to game up their exercises. Current work, though, I moved away now from this, and I tried to create a more complex game. So here's where I have to do a shout out to my co-author. So Tori Mandelli and I, we have a book contract. We're publishing a book on game-based learning. It's called The Allure of Play, and with a little luck, it should be out in 2018 from West Virginia University Press. And a lot of the backbone of this book is about applying some traditional scholarship of teaching and learning practices to how to assess games, how to figure out what the problem area in your discipline is, or in your own particular classroom. Ask yourself a series of questions to drill in and target that particular area. And then, of course, the learning activity design, or game design, which led me to create another game, which has a slightly less fun title, which is Complex Mechanics, 9 gamed up teaching approaches. But we have some fun pictures, and hopefully we'll show you guys some slides of these. But this theory, basically, I for the past few years, I've been thinking about what are core learning activities, what's a sort of canon of learning activities that teachers have been using that are already a little bit interactive. And I came up with 9 of them. Trivia questions, some act of classifying pieces. Categorization game. Some act of deduction, like you might normally find in a scavenger hunt. Some act of simulation and role play. So I came up with sort of categories for these things. Then I found learning principles that other theorists like G have explored in games, and that I thought that these particular gamed up teaching approaches were bringing out. And then also engagement principles that could naturally work in these activities. And I found that teachers really appreciate starting with something like this because it's something familiar. Oh, I've done a classification exercise before, but how is that like a game? Well, have you thought about how to make it a little bit more random or a little bit more rapid? Some kind of sorting exercises, introducing cards into this. So now the teachers are literally having sort of the mechanics and a framework to slowly move into thinking about how to make game-based learning work for them.
Yeah, interesting. So they have a buy and a hook. Actually, so I have to ask, did you kind of come about these categories intuitively? Did you look and observe what was going on in classrooms around you? Did you consult the literature to find out what was most popular? How did
Yeah,
you come
good
on this?
question.
Yeah.
So at first, some of this was intuitive, but that didn't bring me very far. So I started looking at what is it that people are doing that are learning activities? What are the most popular learning activities? What are learning activities that are boring but still popular, like trivia questions?
Yeah.
And how can little elements be added to them to actually make them more rigorous?
Mhm.
So, for example, with a traditional Jeopardy style quiz, having the students design some of these questions can actually add an element, a learning principle called co-design, where the students are involved in the process, or cleverly designing the questions to your Jeopardy or quiz review so that the answers to the early questions can help the students with answers to the next questions.
Yeah.
I've very rarely seen, faculty use a trivia question game like this, but anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So I did some exploration on traditional learning activities, and I found ones that are similar, and I tried to come up with a template for what was the backbone that each of them had in common.
I think that's really great. I believe, I come from very much, so I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm coming from more traditional learning and memory, and for me, when I see all these creative ideas come from the game-based learning world, I always want to anchor them to something. Either I want to anchor them to the physiology of learning, but I at least want to anchor them to the current scholarship of teaching and learning that exists. And not everybody does that, and they don't necessarily have to, but what I think is really great and what has always been what has been lacking is a grammar of games for me. That there's a parlance that game designers generally use, and this is both in the digital world and the non-digital and the academic and the non-academic, and there's an overlapping vocabulary, but very few people are really writing it down or coming up with operational definitions of what is this. And this is a great start to saying, look, this is a mechanic, a core mechanic, and we're going to put a name on it, and we're going to describe how it goes. And that means that the thing can be studied elsewhere from other people from different angles. It can be permutated on, and so on and so forth. So I really like that you're heading in this direction.
Something familiar that teachers can grasp onto and understand. Okay, this is what I'm doing. This is the word for what I'm doing. I like classification exercises. Where do I go from here?
Yeah, and I'd like to, from transitioning from your game 1 to game 2, I'd like to say that we've both observed you in the CUNY Games Network hosting these workshops, and we've also used the What's Your Game Plan deck. I use it in my own classes. I've taught other people to use it. It is a really, really powerful tool. It's a great first step in getting people interested in programming games, making games, not necessarily programming. And so in your new deck, I think you alluded to the fact that you said this would be something that might be used before What's Your Game Plan. Am I correct? So
Yep.
All right.
So one interesting limitation, let's say, with What's Your Game Plan, or maybe just an inevitable constraint, is that it jumps people to thinking about mechanics. It avoids the learning activity. So sometimes you get something that looks like a pretty fun game, but it needs a lot more work to come back to the core to make sure that the teachings come across. And with my new game, it sort of veers on the other side. You get something that looks very much like a traditional learning activity and would be great in the classroom, and is only a little bit gamed up, unless you work on it a little bit more and understand the pedagogy behind a game design. But that's perhaps exactly where it should be.
Yeah, and that speaks to what experts say about teaching as you start from the learning outcome and you work work your way backwards. To your own defense, though, I've never felt in giving the What's Your Game Plan workshop that there was a deficiency. Usually that when there was an emphasis on the game design aspect, I think because the people I give the workshop to, and probably you as well, they know what the learning outcome is, and they know how they want to. So I wouldn't say it's broken in any way. But I like that you're getting more granular and that you're trying to unpacking or maybe even scaffolding what it means to get to the learning outcome in smaller steps. That's
Yeah,
cool. That's so
absolutely.
great. Yeah. So how many times have you run the workshop, and what are the...
So this game, complex mechanics game,
Yeah.
is pretty new. So I've only run the workshop, I think, about 4 times, and
Okay.
some other people have been using this. But again, this game is using theories that have appeared in my articles or that I've actually talked about in my keynotes or presentations.
Yeah.
So that's nothing different. And I've even used some of these cards as sort of an ad hoc expansion
Yeah.
to what's your game plan.
So you're starting from a core theory and you're spinning several games off. It almost sounds like you're a scientist, Joe.
A game, yeah,
Yeah.
learning scientist.
Yeah.
That's what we all can aspire to be, really.
Yeah. So are you linking the theories, you refer to your own theories about how this all works, which I think is a great way to kind of start from scratch, but are you also connecting to the theories of other people like Jim G or...
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And my colleague, Victoria Mandeli, and the book that we're writing,
Yeah.
she's helping me with this too. But basically, we're coming up with a core set of what we call engagement principles, deep learning principles, and assessment principles.
Cool.
And we're moving off of other people who've done a lot of work in this field, like James G., or much
Yeah.
older familiar research like Piaget or Etienne, if I'm pronouncing his
Vygotsky.
name, and Vygotsky. We can't forget Vygotsky.
Yeah. No, this is great. That's great.
And simplifying a little bit for anyone who just wants a 10-second splash of what these theories are. In addition to the theories behind the complex mechanics, I have this theory behind what I call simple mechanics, which is that there's basically 5 quick ways that you could think about how to make your exercise a little bit more gamed up. And that's to think about the pace of your exercise. Can you make it a little bit more random
Yeah.
or a little bit more rapid? And what it means to make it random or rapid, that's getting into the pedagogy, but let's just start with the metaphor.
Yeah.
Or you could think about the goal of your exercise. Can you make it involve rewards? Can you make it involve a little bit of role play? Or can you make it involve some kind of rivalry? So just a note for our viewers to think about these 5 simple mechanics and how you can add them
Cool.
to your exercise.
Okay. What are example of some of the mechanics? I know of a few. Can you maybe talk about one of them and maybe relate it to an example of how you might use it in a classroom or something?
Yep. So I'll talk about one of my favorite ones. So one of the complex mechanics that I say discovered and classified is what I call cut-ups.
Yeah.
And you hear cut-ups, and you probably already know what it means, but I call this basically creating any kind of linear concept or procedure by reassembling information. This is what your students would be doing. So when you have an exercise that involves cut-ups, it taps into some learning principles called situated meanings and well-ordered problems. But some sample exercises that might involve cut-ups, you might cut up every sentence from a short essay or from a poem.
Right. Okay.
And then you ask your students to reassemble this. And actually, my office mate and colleague, Julie Cassidy, created a wonderful exercise where that's exactly what the students are doing.
Okay.
We've got a three-paragraph essay. They're following little prompts on the cut-up sentences like transition words to try to teach them about organization and close reading to reassemble this in order. It doesn't have to be humanities or reading. You could cut up every term from a math formula for a science formula. You could have something more visual like a business flow chart and cut it up. But it's all about reassembling information and trying to understand a linear order.
So I love that it's very constructivist, which is something our viewers will probably understand that students are assembling and putting things together. I love that. But the thing that I think makes it, even though you can do spatial and temporal reconstructions of things, let's say one of our colleagues is building a brain anatomy game and you can have different parts of the brain and the student can assemble them.
Yes.
And it's a spatial, but then you can also have a history game where people are reassembling the elements. What makes it really cool to me is that you are giving them the source material to work with. So it's teaching on 2 levels. You could take a historical narrative, fracture it, mix up the parts, and then have the student reassemble them. So it's both constructivist, but it's also informing them of the vocabulary and the concepts in just-in-time manner, right? Yeah,
because they
it's
have
really
to apply
clever.
it immediately and then think about what are the inherent rules in this discipline that's informing the
Yeah,
decisions I'm making
yeah,
about what the correct order is.
right, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, chemistry sets. I think this has been a mechanic that people have used for a really long time, but maybe not had the right name for it. And I like this. I like this notion of
exactly. It's been a
yeah.
traditional learning activity that sometimes people are using, but we're not quite sure what act
Yeah.
we're performing.
Cool.
Can I give a second example?
Yes, please.
So another one, which I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, would be what I call classify the pieces.
Yeah.
And the idea in a classify the pieces exercise is that essentially your students are evaluating any facts, concepts, or procedures by classifying them into categories. The visual I like to have in mind is that you have your container categories and then you have your details. So the exercise involved has to be something where information is being sorted into categories. For
Yeah.
example, you might sort different issues by what cases they were supposed to go with or what historical events they were supposed to go with.
Yeah.
You might do something a little bit more granular, like you have statements and short arguments, and you're just like, is this logical or illogical? And you're doing it rapidly because
Yeah.
this information is on cards.
Yeah.
You could break down a reading into different categories, characterizations, major characters, effects on the plot, famous quote that category this character said, and have the students help you classify the reading. Doesn't have to be literature, it could be a textbook on the board.
Yeah.
There's something, and some of our viewers are probably thinking, why is that? I can understand the learning behind there, but why is that fun? There's something about classifying information that if it's not too overwhelming and if it's visual, just feels so pleasing.
Yeah. 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 Well, I think there's a whole world of possibilities, depending on. You were talking about the pace in the game, and it's up to the instructor. You could have a very fast-paced classification that can be very fun and active and engaging. So if your classroom is slowing down and they're wanting for some kind of activity, fast classification is a quick way of maybe reviewing some concepts.
Yes. Yeah.
But if you want them to get engaged in deliberated decision making, then you give them a bunch of ambiguous things like, is this fake news or real news? Or what is the attitude of the speaker? Or is this, some kind of ambiguous situation where, as the instructor, it doesn't fall into one category or another. And then you watch them struggle or deliberate over
Discuss,
why. Yeah.
debate. Yeah, I like how you point out the difference between moving rapidly and moving slowly.
Yeah.
Rapid tends to be better suited towards some kind of review or overviewing of something, whereas a slower pace is having them tend towards more higher level evaluation skills.
Yeah, yeah. And it's, again, I'm going to repeat what I said before. The notion of putting labels and providing operational definitions for all these things means I can take one of your labeled grammars and link it to the classification literature in psychology and perception. And I can say, look, this is how the brain thinks. This is how we classify visual information, auditory information, concepts. And then you're not standing as a game designer and an instructor. You're not standing alone needing to have reinvented the wheel. There's going to be a connection here. I also want to speak to the possibility that, like we say in I guess it started in medical school, they say half of what we're teaching you in medical school is wrong, we just don't know which half. And indeed, half of what we're talking about in pedagogy is going to be wrong. So if I want to ask you as a designer now, when you're designing these products for other instructors, and if you knew that half of it was wrong, like how do you deal with that process as a designer yourself? What is your process for designing these games?
Ooh, so do you mean in designing these metagames for teachers, or just in designing like a regular learning game to teach a skill?
Well, these for teachers.
Yeah. Well, then it's time for the revised edition.
The confession
But also,
section.
it's nice that when you have a game that's on cards, there's not that much text. You have to think about really what goes on it. But I've already changed them so many times, or the principles I realized have had better names to them. And this is a challenge of being an educator when you evaluate what you're doing and you realize that there's a better way to say it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a challenge, but
Yeah.
you keep evolving it. You find a better way to say it, and I think one's audience appreciates that, especially because you're partly responding to their feedback.
Right.
Well.
When you test these games in early sessions, I imagine you see what's working and what's not, and then you
Yep.
incorporate that.
And I'm glad you mentioned about applying the classification mechanic, seeing what has been similarly said about it in your discipline, because I almost forgot a very important part. These convex mechanics are actually classified by Bloom. So I'm using Bloom's taxonomy, Bloom's cognitive processes, Bloom's knowledge types. And that was something that I wasn't doing at first.
Yeah.
And then I realized, why not classify these learning activity archetypes by Bloom? So,
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and it's funny how that theory has. Bloom does remind me actually a lot of Piaget, where there was a lot of intuition that went into developing these theories. Not a lot of data was collected, but they have still managed to persist, which is great. It shows the power of their intuition as scientists, and later it's been borne out and established and reinforced by data collection. Not everybody is a scientist like me, and not everybody is going to generate or iterate their products based on the data that they see. But a lot of people do that in an intuitive way. So when you're doing and developing these games, whether for instructors or not, what do you use as the feedback loop to sort of design, iterate, perfect, publish?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to break this up into these sort of metagames for instructors and business managers, and also games that just to teach skills like vocabulary building game or spelling game. With the metagames, I have the great happiness and luxury to be doing workshops. So it's not just a game you get off a website, though you can do that, and that I don't hear from you again. But I'm seeing, because I'm in the room, I see how people are understanding or not understanding elements of the game, and how the game could be changed to better reach what I see as my goal or the goals of the audience. With games that are teaching other elements, like I'm developing a game to teach spelling and vocabulary building. Of course, there's testing with students, but there's also just playing the game with other faculty who are interested in conducting, in teaching that same kind of learning outcome. And how do they do it? What is it that they're looking for the students to get out of this? And then, of course, traditional assessment with your students, looking at quantitative or qualitative
What
surveys.
works and what, and we have to kill our darlings occasionally, right? We have to get rid of things that don't work.
My colleague, our colleague, Carlos Hernandez, though, likes to say that even a badly designed game can still often be amazing in the classroom, especially if it's short, and it could lead to an excellent debrief with the students about what did you learn from this and what didn't you learn from this.
Right. Yeah. I could go into a long diatribe about how we always emphasize our successes, but we actually learn more from failures. Game designers and
it's one of our mottos, right? Fail forward.
Fail forward, young squire. But it is important to also, I think, pay attention in the classroom on the why something failed, why it didn't work. We push people to success too quickly, I believe. But I wanted to shift directions just a little bit because you talked and mentioned about at least one of our partners, Carlos Hernandez, who was also a co-founder, I believe, of Community Games. And then there's Frank Krakow, who's now at Excelsior College, who is also co-founder. So together you designed a learning platform, at least with Frank. You designed this learning platform called Level Fly, which is a gamified learning management system. Do you want to talk a little about that?
Absolutely. Yes, so some years ago, my colleague Frank Krakow, and we partnered with an educational games designer in New York City. His name is Tam Yang.
Yes.
So we three had this sort of vision for coming up with some way to have students have a kind of an achievement system surrounding the work that they were doing in college. So not just grades, but badges or getting some kind of experience points or reward for just turning in homework, or just a more visual depiction of the kinds of conversations that might happen on a learning management system,
Yeah.
but to make it a little bit more fun, bring in some of the mechanics of social media,
Yeah.
such as a like system. It was as you can imagine, making even a small learning management system was a horrendous amount of work, but it got done.
Wow. Yeah.
And we presented it to the school. It was used to teach, it still is being used to teach many classes.
Great.
The school even did a very rigorous study to try to measure what they saw, how they define, success of the product. I believe the N, they looked at 680 students. They were looking at classes taught with Level Fly and classes not taught with Level Fly. But to my knowledge, quantitatively, they were only looking at two things: retention and increases in grades. There were significant increases in both retention in grades in non-remedial classes.
Okay.
And for some reason, and I wish, I was still on this project so I could examine this more closely. In the remedial classes, there were extreme increases. Extreme.
That's encouraging. Yeah. That's actually what I would suspect. So what are your speculation as to why?
So we know that anyone who's been reading about, the biggest problem with retention in colleges is that students don't have a sense of belonging at their campus. And so they'll leave because they just feel like they're not invested in their school.
No social support.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we could re-theorize a school's learning management system as not being about, I'm going to use these words again, managing the learning, but giving them some kind of academic social network where they can participate with each other. There's already a model for this. Things like Facebook, people are participating with each other even though that's not an academic setting. Then they can start to feel a part of not only their class, but perhaps other clubs and things that are happening at school through a mechanism that they're familiar with. If you can bring in some of the elements of game-based learning, badge systems to reward certain behavior, these are things that a teacher might not do in a regular classroom, not necessarily because we don't want to, but because there could be a big technical back end behind tracking all of this information for a student. But a learning management system, if it's good at anything, is good at, tracking information. Well, what if we took that mechanic that it's already good at and made it more visually engaging and appealing?
Yeah, that's interesting.
And therefore of great need, of course, to the remedial students.
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed the social support component would have been what you believe to be the driving factor, but it makes complete sense when you looked at, I could believe there's Department of Education programs, Connect Ed. I'll have to look this up and post this correctly later, but I think Connect Ed was studying how communities of learning develop and support students through that. I've had personal experience. I started an undergraduate research club on my campus as the director of undergraduate research, and to my surprise, it just blossomed. Students love to hang out with each other.
Really?
They love to talk about. There was no cross-disciplinary format for students to talk about research, but they were all in some kind of research. So that community of learning was complete. I just set it up and then I let it go. And the students took ownership of it. So the fact that could be brought into a learning management system that can seem very impersonal. I mean, no knocks against Blackboard. It's a wonderful piece of software and does a lot of amazing things. But it is a very solitary, isolated thing. The groups component is very lonely, even though you can interact with people in groups and things like that. And even if there's video chat, that still could be implemented in some systems. I think most people feel very isolated when they're doing that.
But what if we could redefine this thing, which has been executed poorly, the Blackboard system, and make it not so much a learning management system, but the elements of a learning management system, elements of a social network, and elements of what Frank and I called an achievement system.
Right.
And make that all digital. blended together. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's another point that I want to comment on. Many of us who teach, we know that students are very much tied to secondary reinforcers, grades, grades on exams, GPA, all of these things, and no matter how much you try and break them of that habit and focus on true intrinsic motivations in learning, the specter of these secondary reinforcers always rears its head. It's like, I love this class, but what did I get on my grade? And the cool thing that I love about using experience points is it starts to reward people for work and effort rather than focusing on the reward. Now, I'm sure they would still a point-based system, but bear with me, and this sort of dovetails with maybe Carol Dweck's theories on having a growth mindset. So in this case, a student, maybe the remedial student who has been struggling for a really long time and just feels, oh, I'm not getting good grades, I'm not getting good grades, why try? Now if they can monitor their progress and effort via experience points, they might have feedback for engagement, and that might kickstart this intrinsic motivation for learning.
You know, that you just, because it's been so many years, that was exactly our thinking.
Okay.
Targeting the, right.
Okay, yeah.
Especially because we have
way.
a high stakes,
Yeah.
100% pass or fail test at the end of the remedial
Wow.
class.
Yeah. Ooh,
Right.
scary.
So it's like, well, why am I doing these assignments?
Yeah.
You know, kind of an attitude. But whether we're adults or we're young adults, you know, in the workplace or in the classroom, we want to see some kind of like indication of attention to what we're doing, some kind of mark. So when the student sees that they're getting little points or going up a level for finishing assignments, oh my gosh, it's a visual indicator of what they're doing, as opposed to maybe not even a grade.
Sure.
And just waiting until week 15 when you take this test, which is either pass or fail.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know enough about this, but there are several colleges that have experimented, and then several departments and disciplines that have experimented with abandoning the grade structure. And
right.
I believe, from what I understand, I mean, the only model I really have of this is UC Santa Cruz, University of California at Santa Cruz, where they got rid of, for a very long period of time, they got rid of grades. You could petition to have grades, but you would get a course evaluation, I believe, from your instructor. And the scary thing for me about this is that it does place an enormous amount of work on the faculty member, which decreases the quality of feedback an instructor can give. Let me dovetail that with the learning management system. So in your learning management system, there's a possibility of the student getting their own feedback on engagement, and then that could free up the instructor to provide more quality feedback on the nature of the assignment or a particular thing. I mean, if we design the system really well, then the student should know that they've achieved it correctly. The student doesn't need the validation of the instructor. They know they've done that correctly. They've checked all the boxes. They got the thesis statement correct because they've done this correct.
Right.
It's a possibility. So in your system, it's also another means for you to teach instructors. Have you thought about combining the game-based learning mechanics that you're doing into the LMS so that you could hand over this entire package to a college and say, we're not just going to gamify the outcomes, we're going to show you how to teach?
In other words, using the LMS as a professional development platform for doing online instruction. Yeah, I've definitely thought about it. I'm not there yet. But
it's okay if yeah. Well, we can explore this idea. I mean, this is the point of these conversations, is that...
and one element, of course, is that as game-based learning gets larger and larger, there's more of a demand for professional development. But I think a lot of schools and teaching directors are still slowly realizing that, you know, games is just a metaphor. This is student-centered. This is pedagogy, student-centered learning. This is learning activities made more formal.
Right. Designing human experiences. Everything you said. So I did get a grant by the CUNY Advanced Foundation to create some game-based learning courses. And the end product, unfortunately, the grant mechanism got canceled, so I never got to bring it to its final stages, but the idea was to build a module that could plug into Blackboard and it was a game-based learning module, so it'd be theoretically be discipline independent, but it would show an instructor how to incorporate some game mechanics into their course. And I could already see some of the challenges I was going to face in doing this, but it seems like if you have control of the LMS and you have a vocabulary of learning mechanics, that some of these things could be put into the LMS. And
That's true. And you reminded me what some other groups had commented, that it would be useful to have level 5 function not so much as a standalone light LMS, but as a component for a larger LMS like Blackboard.
Yeah.
As an extension.
Or some other, I don't know about, so the original open source was Moodle, and I don't know if you're familiar with Moodle, but yeah, so that would have been, I think, a prime platform to plug into, because I think there'd be more flexibility, but maybe some of the newer ones like Canvas is what I'm hearing about that I don't know very well. But Blackboard plugins, I believe, are rather complicated to create, maybe to adopt. I mean, there's this institutional hurdle of who's going to pay for it, how is it going to be, is it SCORM compliant, all of that stuff. So you've dealt with a lot of that. Do you think it makes more sense for developers who are trying to do something innovative like you're doing to develop a plugin, or?
So this is a pretty complex question, but just in case we have any burgeoning software developers listening to this, the short answer is that the learning management system market is vast, complex, and pretty difficult to get into. But EdTech is booming, and you don't necessarily have to be an LMS, whatever that means. You could have some other smaller thing that you're offering to the college or to the instructor, even just a better grade book that they could get benefit from.
Yeah, there's some modules. I know some schools pass out computers or iPads to their students, and maybe there's modular software that could be designed for that. And highlighting the importance of partnerships, academics like yourself who really understand the guts of this, partnering with expert software developers, it might be future. So maybe independent of that endeavor, I might ask, well, what are your plans for the future? I know you've been writing books, you've got game-based learning books, you've got a whole bunch of things on the docket.
So I'm interested in pursuing, now that I've done a lot of these sort of meta exercises and thinking about the process of game design, I'm interested more in looking at a challenging problem, either in the educational world, some kind of instructional problem in the educational world or the business world, and trying to create a simulation or a visualization tool or some kind of interactive game or training or workshop for that. And I'm slowly starting to do this. And personally, I just find it to be extremely challenging, extremely creative, and therefore, I guess, hearkening back, to your original question about, my degree in English and creative writing. Like, what more can I ask for than to think really hard and to do it in a creative way?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And I mean, as academics, we constantly have to keep ourselves interested, right? It's weird the turns we take. It really is. I mean, I'm a neuroscientist who's now doing game-based learning, and you were doing classic English literature and creative writing. So, but for me, I think that's the excitement of the future is creating new genres. Really, it's not about creating new content for genres. It's creating new genres, and I believe that is going to involve intersection of disciplines. It's going to involve intersection of practices, of technology, of all these things all at once, and it's going to be really exciting. So how can people get in touch with you if they want to look at your games, if they want to send you an email?
Absolutely. So I have a website for professional development. There's lots of resources there for people interested in learning more about game-based learning. The website is my name, joebisz.com. That's JoeBizz. So if you go to joebiz.com, you'll find more information about me, my research, my games, and possibly other collaborations.
All right. So. Exciting. Cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, CUNY Games Network, in which you are a part of, but for telling us all about your work, and we're looking forward to seeing what's coming next.
This is great, Rob.
Cool. Cheers.
Take care, everyone.